The dog had been chained to that post for 19 days. Deputy Colt Rains knew this because he had been the one to chain him there. He'd counted every morning when he pulled into the lot of Harlan County's only gas station, coffee in one hand, the other resting on the grip of his pistol like it belonged there, like authority was something you wore on your hip. The dog, a German shepherd, big-boned and black and tan, with eyes the color of old copper, had stopped fighting the chain somewhere around day 4. Before that, he'd pulled and twisted and whimpered through the nights, his howls carrying across the empty county road and into the hills where nobody lived who would do anything about it. By day 7, he'd gone quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when something living decides that hoping costs too much. His name had been Duke once. His owners, a young couple named the Parkers, had moved out of Harlan 3 weeks ago, overwhelmed by debt and a landlord who wouldn't wait. They'd taken everything they could fit in a single pickup truck and left Duke behind, tied to the fence post, believing that someone in this town would take him in. That was the kind of faith small-town people had sometimes. Misplaced and generous, and heartbreaking in equal measure. Deputy Colt Rains had found Duke the next morning. He hadn't taken him in. He'd relocated the chain to the gas station post because, as he told the owner, Bobby Marsh, having a big dog out front was good for business. Deterrent. Bobby Marsh had said nothing, because Bobby Marsh had learned years ago that saying nothing to Colt Rains was the safest language in Harlan County. The deputy had connections that ran up through the sheriff's office, and further than that, into places Bobby didn't want to think about. So he'd nodded and gone back inside, and every morning for 19 days he'd watched through his window as Colt Rains arrived, circled Duke the way a hawk circles something already dying, and occasionally reminded the dog who owned this corner of the world. The reminders weren't gentle. This particular morning, a Tuesday in October, sky the color of old pewter, temperature already dropping towards something that bit. Colt Rains arrived at 7:43, and Duke lifted his head from the concrete just long enough to track the deputy's approach. The chain allowed him roughly 4 feet of movement in any direction. His water bowl had been empty since yesterday afternoon. His ribs were visible through his coat, individual ridges you could count from 10 feet away, the evidence of 19 days of deliberate reduction. Rains crouched in front of him, coffee cup in hand, and smiled. It wasn't a smile that meant anything warm. It was the smile of a man who enjoyed the specific pleasure of power over something that couldn't fight him back. "You still looking at me like that?" Rains said. "Like you think something's going to change." Duke held his gaze. That was the one thing the 19 days hadn't taken from him, the refusal to look away. He'd stopped fighting the chain, and stopped making noise, and stopped trying to stand when his legs trembled from hunger. But he hadn't dropped his eyes. He looked at Rains the way something looks at a threat it's cataloging, memorizing, filing away for a future that logic said wasn't coming. But something deeper than logic refused to stop believing in. Rains didn't like that look. He stood up, set his coffee on the hood of his cruiser, and picked up the wooden dowel he kept in the back seat. Not a nightstick, nothing official. Just a smooth piece of hickory about the length of a forearm, worn at the handle from use. He'd had it for 2 years. It served a specific purpose. Inside the gas station, Bobby Marsh pressed his back against the wall behind the register and closed his eyes. Across the street, in the diner that opened at 6, a waitress named Carol Deeds watched through the window and felt her stomach turn the way it turned every morning at this time, a slow revolution of helpless nausea. She'd called the county animal control twice in the first week. Both times she'd been told the animal was in the care of a county officer and the situation was being monitored. The second time, the person on the phone had said her name before she gave it, which was how she understood that the call had already been flagged, that Rains already knew, and that a third call would be her last one from this area code. She hadn't called again. She watched. Rains raised the dowel. Duke didn't flinch. He turned his copper eyes up toward the sound of the impact coming, and he held them open and he took it. The crack of hickory against his left shoulder, the shock of pain that rippled down through his foreleg and buckled it beneath him. He went down on that side, and the chain went taut, and the concrete was cold against his ribs. He lay there breathing. Rains stepped back, satisfied, retrieved his coffee. "Good," he said. Staying down now. That's learning. He didn't notice the truck. It had pulled into the far end of the lot 60 seconds earlier. A dark green F-250, maybe 8 years old, rode dirty and deliberate, the kind of vehicle that had covered serious miles without apology. It had come off the highway and rolled to a slow stop near the air pump, engine idling. And the man inside had not moved. He was watching. He had been watching since before Rains raised the dowel. James Callum was 39 years old, and he had been out of the Navy for 14 months, which was not long enough to have stopped thinking like he was still in it. 14 months of civilian life, and he still parked with his back to walls, still assessed every room for exits before he sat down in it, still read threat levels into posture and movement, and the angle of a man's shoulders, the way other people read weather. He couldn't help it. 12 years as a Navy SEAL didn't leave when you took off the uniform. It just went quiet and watched and waited. The way Duke had been watching and waiting. And sometimes James thought the best and worst thing about his training was that it had made him incapable of looking away from things that needed to be looked at. He had stopped for gas. That was all. He was passing through Harlan on his way to visit his brother in Knoxville, a trip he'd been putting off for 2 months, and finally forced himself to make. He had no history in this town, no connection to this gas station, or this dog, or this deputy with his hickory stick and his practiced, casual cruelty. He had a full tank of coffee in his thermos, and a full day of driving ahead of him, and a brother who was expecting him by 6. He watched Deputy Colt Rains walk back to his cruiser. He looked at the German Shepherd on the ground, ribs working with each breath, left leg trembling. He sat for 11 seconds. Then he turned off the engine. His dog, a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois named Rook, was in the back seat in his travel crate, and he lifted his black masked face as the engine went silent, and watched James the way he always watched him, with total attention, with the precise calibration of an animal trained to read human intention before humans had finished intending it. Rook had done 2 deployments with James. He'd been retired from service 8 months ago due to a shrapnel injury to his right hind leg that had healed enough for civilian life, but not enough for operational work. James had adopted him without a second's hesitation and driven 14 hours to pick him up and had not once regretted it. "Stay," James told him. Rook's ears said he disagreed, but his body said he understood. James got out of the truck. The cold air hit him, clean and sharp, the smell of rain coming from the hills to the west. He walked across the lot at an even pace. Not fast, not slow. The pace of a man who had decided something and was implementing the decision. Rains was leaning against his cruiser, scrolling his phone, coffee balanced on the roof. He looked up when he heard footsteps, and his expression arranged itself into the particular configuration of a man who believed his uniform answered all questions before they were asked. "Morning," Rains said. "You need something?" James stopped 6 feet away. He looked at Duke on the ground, at the chain, at the hickory dowel Rains had set on the hood of the cruiser. He looked at Rains. "That your dog? That's county property." Rains's voice had the particular flatness of a man who used monotone as a dominance tool. "Something I can help you with?" "How long has he been chained here?" Rains studied him. "Long enough." "You passing through?" "Yeah." "Then keep passing." Rains looked back at his phone. James didn't move. "I saw what you just did to him." Rains lowered his phone slowly. The pleasant blankness left his face, and something else moved in underneath it. Something that had been waiting just below the surface, the way things wait in still water. "You want to think carefully about what you say next. Friend, I'm not your friend." James's voice was even. "And I want you to fill that bowl. The water bowl. It's been empty since yesterday." Rains stared at him. Then he laughed, and the laugh was the kind designed to establish a hierarchy, to remind someone of their position in a space. "Son, I don't know who you think you are. James Callum, former Lieutenant Commander, SEAL Team 3. He said it the way you state a coordinate, not for pride, as information. And I've been sitting in that truck for about 2 minutes, which means I have footage on my dash cam of you striking that animal with a piece of wood, and I have questions about what the county's actual policy is on the custody of abandoned animals. And I have a lot of time today. So if you want to make this complicated, I am genuinely prepared for complicated." Rains went still. It was a specific kind of stillness. the stillness of a predator who has just encountered something that doesn't respond to the usual signals. He'd used that uniform and that badge and that hickory stick to manage this county for 6 years, and the system had held, because everyone in it understood the rules. This man was standing in front of him like someone who had read different rules entirely, and found them more binding. "You got no jurisdiction here," Rains said finally. "No," James said, "but I've got a phone, and apparently enough bars to upload a dashcam video to about 4 different platforms." He pulled out his phone and checked it with the mild interest of a man checking the weather. "Yeah, full signal. Interesting for a town this size." Rains's jaw tightened. "Fill the bowl," James said again, "and then you and I are going to have a conversation about what happens to this dog." Bobby Marsh, watching from behind his register, had lived in Harlan County for 51 years. He had seen 3 sheriffs, 2 floods, 1 fire that took the old mill, and approximately 6,000 mornings of Colt Rains, doing whatever Colt Rains wanted in the lot of his Gaspee station. He had learned to witness without reacting, to see without registering, to survive through strategic invisibility. It was a skill he was not proud of, but had not known how to replace. He watched Colt Rains fill the dog's water bowl. Bobby Marsh put his hand over his mouth and stood very still, because he didn't want to make a sound that might disturb whatever was happening. Duke lifted his head when the water hit the bowl. He pulled himself forward on his good leg, favoring the left, and drank, slow at first. Then urgently. The kind of drinking that said the thirst had been building for hours, and the body had almost stopped expecting relief. James watched him drink. Rains watched James. "This isn't finished," Rains said quietly. "You're passing through. You'll be gone by noon, and this situation will go back to the way it was." James looked at him. "No, it won't, because what are you going to do about it?" James crouched down beside Duke, who had finished drinking and was now watching him with those copper eyes that had not dropped through 19 days of beatings. He extended the back of his hands slowly, the way you approached an animal that had been taught that hands meant pain. Duke's nostrils worked. He sniffed once, twice. Then he pressed his nose against James's knuckles, and something in the gesture, something in the specificity of a traumatized animal choosing to make contact, landed in James's chest like a weight, being set down. "Hey," he said quietly, "I've got you." He looked up at Rains. "I'm not gone by noon." The call came at 9:17. James had moved his truck closer to the post, positioned so the dashcam covered Duke at all angles. He'd given the dog the rest of his road beef jerky through the fence, and Rook had watched from the back window, with the patient dignity of an animal that understood mission priorities, even when it involved sharing protein. James had called his brother in Knoxville, and said he was going to be late. His brother had said how late, and James had said he didn't know yet. The call at 9:17 was from a number he didn't recognize. A 606 area code. "Local," he answered. A woman's voice, low and careful, like someone talking with the volume turned down not from timidity, but from tactical necessity. "You're the man at Bobby's lot." "Yes. I saw what you did this morning. What you said to Rains." There was a pause. "You should know what you're actually dealing with. Tell me." "Colt Rains isn't just a deputy," the woman said. "He's Sheriff Darrell Vance's nephew. He's been Vance's errand boy for 6 years. The dog isn't just a dog to him, it's a message. He put it there after the Parkers left, because Ray Parker tried to report Vance to the state police 8 months ago. Something about county funds. The report went nowhere. Rains took the dog the next morning. It's a demonstration." James looked at Duke. That specific, cold rage that he'd learned to name without letting name him moved through him cleanly. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who's been trying to find a way out of this situation for 2 years, the woman said. "My name is Deputy Claire Addison. I'm Rains's partner. Or I was, until I started asking the wrong questions. Now I'm on administrative leave." She paused. "I have documentation, 3 years of it. Financial records, incident reports that were buried, a list of witnesses who were pressured into silence. But I have nobody to give it to, because every avenue I've tried has gone back to Vance." James was quiet for a moment. "Where are you?" "Diner across the street. The woman in the green coat by the window." "That's me." James turned his head. Through the diner window, He could see a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair, green coat, watching him with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for something, without knowing what shape it would take. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. He looked at Rook in the back seat, looked at Duke at the post, looked at the cruiser still sitting at the edge of the lot, Rains inside it now, watching his phone, or appearing to. James had been in enough hostile environments to understand when a situation was larger than it first appeared. He'd walked into what looked like a single problem and found himself looking at the edge of something that had been running underground for years, something that had a dog chained to a post as its most visible symbol, and something much worse as its actual substance. He got out of the truck. He told Rook to stay. He crossed the street. Claire Addison had been a deputy in Harlan County for 7 years, the first 4 of which she had believed she was doing something meaningful. She was 34 years old, precise in the way people become precise when imprecision has cost them, and she laid the folder on the table between them before James had fully sat down, the way someone lays down a weapon they've been carrying too long. "You should read it before you decide anything," she said. James read it. It took 22 minutes. Carol, the waitress, refilled his coffee twice without being asked, moving around them with the careful quietness of someone who understood that what was happening at table 4 was not something to interrupt. Claire sat across from him and watched his face, and he let her watch, because his face, after 12 years of fieldwork, it gave away nothing he didn't choose to give. But inside, the picture assembling itself from those pages was building pressure, the way structural damage builds pressure. Quietly, and then all at once. Sheriff Darrell Vance had been taking a percentage from every major commercial operation in Harlan County for at least 5 years. Not protection money in the traditional sense, more sophisticated than that. He'd positioned himself as an indispensable intermediary for county permits, zoning approvals, liquor licenses, the kind of administrative machinery that businesses couldn't operate without. He'd used Rains and 2 other deputies as enforcement arms. And when someone objected or threatened to object, the enforcement became physical, and the objection disappeared. 3 people had left the county under circumstances that Claire had documented as suspicious, and that the official record classified as voluntary. Relocation. One of them was Ray Parker, Duke's original owner. James set the folder down. He looked at Claire. Ray Parker didn't move voluntarily. "No." "Where is he?" "I don't know." She held his eyes. "I'm telling you that honestly. I know he disappeared after filing the state police report. I know the report was routed through a lieutenant who hunts with Vance every November. I know Ray Parker's wife took their daughter and moved to her mother's in Tennessee, and she doesn't answer calls from 606 numbers anymore." She paused. "I know the dog is still here, because Vance told Rains to keep him visible. He said it was a reminder, proof that trying to stand up changes nothing." James looked out the window at Duke, across the street, at the chain, at the hickory dowel still sitting on the hood of Rains's cruiser. He thought about a man who'd tried to do the right thing and been erased for it. He thought about a dog sitting at a post for 19 days as a monument to what happened when you spoke up. He thought about 12 years of missions, of going into places where power had decided it was permanent, of what he'd learned about the particular arrogance of people who believed their systems were airtight. They never were. "What do you need?" he asked Claire. "Someone to get this to the right people. Not state police. Vance has too many connections. Federal level, FBI, or the U.S. Attorney's office. I've been trying to find a clean channel for 8 months. Every time I think I have one, it leads back to someone who leads back to Vance." "I know someone," James said. Claire blinked. "Just like that?" He looked at her steadily. "My last commanding officer retired and went to work as a federal prosecutor in Lexington. We've kept in touch. He is the least corruptible person I have ever met in my life, which is a statement I make with full professional context." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If this goes wrong, Vance will know it was me. He probably already suspects. If this goes right," James said, "it won't matter what he suspects." He pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. Outside, across the street, Duke pulled himself upright at the end of his chain and stood, trembling slightly in the October cold, facing the diner window, as if he could sense that something had shifted, as if 19 days of watching the same empty lot had given him the ability to detect even a small change in the atmosphere. James looked at him through the glass. Then he dialed. The phone rang twice. A voice answered, clipped and warm in equal measure. The voice of a man who had spent his life making fast decisions. "Commander Holloway," James said. "It's Callum. I'm in Harlan County, Kentucky, and I need 15 minutes of your time." A pause. Then, "You never call unless it's real." "It's real." Another pause. Then, "Talk." James talked. He laid it out the way he'd been trained to lay out field intelligence. Linear, specific, no editorializing, the facts arranged in order of relevance. Claire sat across from him listening to the shape of her 3 years of documentation being translated into the language of people who could actually act on it. Her jaw was tight, but her eyes were steady. When he finished, Holloway was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "I'm going to make 2 calls. Don't move from that location. Don't let the deputy in question leave the area if you can manage it without incident. And Callum, is there an animal involved?" "German Shepherd. 19 days on a chain. He's been struck with a blunt object this morning on camera." Holloway's voice shifted slightly, a barely perceptible tightening. "All right, give me 2 hours." He hung up. James set the phone on the table. Carol, the waitress, had been standing at the edge of the counter, and she looked at James with an expression that was trying very hard to contain something large. "Is it real?" she said. "Is something actually going to happen?" James looked at the folder on the table, looked out at Duke across the street, looked at Claire, who was pressing her hands flat on the table surface, the way people do when they're trying to stop them shaking. "Yes," he said. Carol set down her coffee pot and walked into the back, and nobody in the diner said anything about the sound that came through the kitchen door a moment later. The 2 hours passed with the particular slowness of hours that matter. James went back to his truck. He sat with the engine off and the windows cracked, and Rook's chin on his shoulder from the back seat, both of them watching the lot with the patient attention that was their shared native language. Rains came out of his cruiser once, walked a slow circle around Duke, said something that James couldn't hear but that made Duke press himself flat again, and went back to his vehicle. James documented it on his phone. He sent the clip to Holloway's secure number. Bobby Marsh brought out a bowl of water for Duke, without anyone asking him to. He set it down quickly, didn't look at Raines's cruiser, went back inside. The gesture was small and trembling, and cost him something. James watched it with respect. At 11:40, 3 vehicles turned off the highway into Harlan. Not marked, not local. 2 dark SUVs, and a silver sedan with federal plates that were not hard to read if you knew what to look for. They parked at the far end of the lot with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times and saw no reason to make theater of it. Raines saw them. James watched him see them, watched the recognition move across his face through the windshield, the recalibration, the hand that moved toward his radio and then stopped because he understood, in the precise animal way that people understand when the thing they feared has actually arrived, that the radio wasn't going to help him now. A man in a gray suit got out of the sedan, mid-50s, economical in his movements, the kind of face that had heard every possible version of a lie and retained none of them. He walked to James's truck. James got out. "Holloway told me you were hard to surprise," the man said. "I'm Agent Frank Darrow, FBI Louisville Field Office." He extended his hand. "You have the dashcam footage?" James handed him his phone. Darrow watched it. Then he watched the second clip, the one of Bobby Marsh and his water bowl. He handed the phone back. "We've actually been trying to get into Harlan County for 3 years," Darrow said, his voice absolutely level. "We've had a case file on Vance since before Raines. Every entry point we found went cold." He looked at James. "How'd you get Claire Addison to talk?" "I didn't," James said. "She'd been waiting to talk. I just happened to be the first person who looked like they might be able to do something with it." Darrow studied him for a moment. "Navy. 12 years. SEAL 3. I know your CO. Holloway." "Yes." Darrow looked across the lot at Raines's cruiser, at Duke, at the hickory dowel on the hood of the cruiser that nobody had touched. "Okay," he said. "We move on Vance today. I need Addison's documentation in the next 30 minutes, and I need you to keep that deputy from going anywhere until I have 2 agents positioned." Already have one positioned, James said. His name is Rook. He's in the back seat. Diro looked at the Belgian Malinois regarding him through the window with amber-eyed, black-masked composure. Diro almost smiled. All right, he said. Let's finish this. What happened next took 40 minutes and changed Harlan County in ways that would take years to fully understand. It was not loud. That was the thing James would remember later. How quiet it was. No sirens. No drawn weapons in the parking lot. Just federal agents moving with the unhurried certainty of people holding documentation that closed all the exits before anyone realized the exits were closed. Two agents approached Raines's cruiser from separate angles. He got out when they knocked on his window, and he looked at the badges, and he looked across the lot at James, and he looked at the folder that Claire Addison had just handed to the third agent. All 3 years of it. The original documentation in its physical form. And something in Colt Raines's face went through several expressions before settling on the one that men settle on when they understand that the thing they built was not as solid as they believed. A fourth agent drove to Sheriff Darrell Vance's office on Main Street. Vance was in his chair when they arrived, which is exactly where men like Vance tend to be when everything they've arranged starts to disarrange, sitting in their chairs, in their offices, with their names on the doors, not yet knowing that the name on the door is about to become evidence. He was placed under federal custody at 11:58. At 12:04, as Raines was being moved to one of the dark SUVs, James crossed the lot to the post. He crouched beside Duke, who was watching everything with his copper eyes, his body still close to the ground from 19 days of training himself to stay small. James took the chain in his hands and examined the padlock, a cheap combination model, the kind of lock that said the person who bought it wasn't worried about anyone being able to open it. Bobby Marsh appeared at his shoulder holding bolt cutters. "I've had these under the counter for 2 weeks," Bobby said quietly, "waiting for a reason to use them." James took them. The chain fell. Duke didn't move immediately. He lay there for a long moment, looking at the place where the chain had been, his legs gathered beneath him, his eyes going from the fallen chain to James and back again. The way a thing looks when it's trying to believe that a fundamental fact of its existence has actually changed. James sat down on the concrete beside him, not reaching for him, not pushing anything, just present. "Hey," he said. "You're done here. Chain's off. Nobody's coming at you." Duke lifted his head. He looked at James with those copper eyes that had held their focus through 19 days of everything. Then he pulled himself upright, slowly, trembling on the left leg, where the morning's impact had landed, and he put his nose against James's jaw, and James put his hand on the dog's neck. And they stayed like that for a moment in the middle of the lot, while everything that had been built around them for years came quietly, systematically apart. Rook pressed his face against the truck window and made a sound that was not quite a bark. Carol came out of the diner with a blanket. Bobby Marsh stood at the edge of all of it, with his hand over his mouth again. And this time, the sound he was keeping in was not the kind that made you feel the need to be quiet. James looked up at the hills to the west. Rain coming. He could smell it. He looked at Duke. "Let's get you to a vet," he said, "and somewhere in those hills, in the particular silence that follows the end of something that should have ended long ago." The county of Harlan, Kentucky held its breath and began, very carefully, to exhale. James had not planned on staying in Harlan County past noon. By 2 in the afternoon, he had a German shepherd in the back seat of his truck, a Belgian Malinois pressed against the shepherd's side, like he'd been doing it for years, and a veterinary clinic address on his phone that Claire Addison had texted him before the federal agents took her documentation and told her to stay available. The clinic was called Blue Ridge Animal Care, 4 miles east of town on a 2-lane road that wound between bare October hills, and the woman who ran it was named Dr. Nora Hess, who, according to Claire, was the only person in Harlan County who had treated animals that belonged to people Raines had decided needed a lesson, and had kept her mouth shut about it, not from cowardice, but from the tactical understanding that staying open meant she could keep helping them. Duke lay in the back with his head on Rook's shoulder. Rook held perfectly still, which was not his natural setting, but which he sustained with the focused intentionality of an animal that understood the situation required it. He'd climbed back there himself when James opened the truck door, without command, without hesitation. the way he'd always made the decisions that mattered fastest. James had looked at him for a moment, and then just closed the door. The road to the clinic curved up through a tree line, and the rain that had been threatening since morning finally arrived, soft and steady, the kind that didn't announce itself. James drove with both hands on the wheel, and Duke visible in the mirror, the shepherd's copper eyes open, watching the trees go past the window with an attention that was not fear, but something James recognized as the specific vigilance of a creature, recalibrating its understanding of the world. He'd seen that look in men coming out of bad situations. He knew what it meant. It meant the body was still running the old program while the mind tried to write a new one. And the gap between those two processes was where the hard work lived. Dr. Nora Hess was 51 years old, built like someone who had spent decades doing physical work that required both precision and strength, with gray-streaked hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she never seemed to actually use for reading. She came out to the parking lot when James pulled in, before he'd fully stopped, and she looked at Duke in the back seat through the rain-spotted window, with a clinical expression that was doing a great deal of emotional work underneath it. "How long?" she said. 19 days on the chain. Struck with a blunt object this morning. Left shoulder. She held up a hand. "I know who did it." She opened the back door of the truck. Duke pressed himself against the seat back, the reflex of an animal that had learned that opening doors preceded pain. Nora didn't reach for him. She crouched at the door and put her hands on her knees and waited. And after a moment, Duke extended his nose toward her, and she let him investigate until the investigation satisfied him, and then she put one hand under his chest and one behind his hindquarters, and she lifted him out with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. No wasted motion, no drama. "You too," she said to Rook, who had been watching with intense professional interest. Rook declined. "He's retired service," James said. "He doesn't take direction from people he hasn't assessed yet." Nora looked at the Malinois. Rook looked at Nora. Apparently whatever assessment occurred in those 3 seconds concluded favorably, because Rook stepped out of the truck and followed her into the clinic with the alert dignity of a dog attending a briefing. James followed both of them. The examination took 40 minutes. 3 fractured ribs. 2 cracked, 1 complete. The left shoulder showing deep bruising consistent with repeated blunt force impact over multiple incidents, not just the one this morning. Malnutrition at approximately 65% of healthy body weight. Dehydration. 3 infected lacerations on the neck from the chain collar, one of which had developed a secondary infection that Nora addressed with a focus that excluded everything else in the room for about 8 minutes. James sat in the corner of the examination room on a metal stool and watched, and didn't speak. He had learned in his career that the most useful thing you could sometimes do was occupy space without demanding anything from it. And this was one of those times. Duke lay on the table with the stillness of an animal, past the point of struggling, but his eyes tracked Nora's movements with that same refusal to look away that he'd held in the lot. And twice, when Nora hit a point of particular pain and Duke's muscles went rigid, Rook, standing at the table's edge, made a low sound in his throat that was not quite a whimper and not quite a growl, but something in between that seemed to work as both. "He's been doing that since the truck," James said. Nora didn't look up from her work. "Your Malinois understands more than most people give him credit for. He always has." She administered the antibiotic injection, the IV fluids, the pain management, moving through each step with the economy of someone whose competence was so complete it had become invisible. When she was done, she stood back and looked at Duke, who looked back at her with eyes that were slightly softer than they'd been 40 minutes ago, the specific softening that pain medication makes when it begins to work. The body's first tentative loosening of a grip it had been holding too long. "He's going to need 6 to 8 weeks of proper recovery," Nora said. "Good food, no stress, no physical strain on those ribs." She paused. "He's also going to need time with someone consistent, an animal that's been in his situation, the systematic kind. Not a single incident. Tends to do better with one person who shows up the same way every day. Predictability is what rebuilds trust." James looked at Duke. Duke looked at James. "I'm driving to Knoxville today," James said. Nora began cleaning up. "Is that a statement or a question?" James didn't answer. which was, he recognized, also a kind of answer. Rook sat down next to his leg and pressed his head against James's thigh, which was Rook's understated method of making his opinion known without technically violating the directive to stay out of human decision-making. "Can he travel?" James asked. "Short distances. Carefully. Yes. He'll be more comfortable in the back of a truck than in a kennel here." Nora met his eyes. "If the person driving knows what they're doing." James nodded slowly. He pulled out his phone, called his brother. "Tommy," he said, when the line picked up, "I'm going to need a few more days." His brother was quiet for a moment. "The dog situation you called me about?" "Yeah." "How bad?" James looked at Duke on the table, at the ribs visible through his coat, the careful chemistry of his breathing, the copper eyes that had not stopped watching. "Bad enough that I'm not leaving him in a kennel, in a county that just lost its entire law enforcement leadership in one afternoon." Tommy was quiet again. Then he said, "The guest room can fit a dog bed. 2 dog beds," James said. "Lord." His brother sighed, the sigh of a man who had known James Callum his entire life, and understood that the version of events he was about to experience was going to be significantly more than advertised. "All right, drive safe." James hung up. He looked at Nora. "What do I owe you?" "Not a thing," she said, and her voice had a finality to it that he understood better than to argue with. They left the clinic at 3:45. Duke in the back, Rook beside him, James heading east on the highway, Harlan shrinking in the mirror, and the rain heavier now, proper October rain with weight to it, making the hills gray and close, and the road ahead look like a thing being written as you traveled it. His phone buzzed at 4:20. "Agent Darrow." James answered on the truck's speaker. "Update," Darrow said. "Vance is in custody, processed at the Louisville field office. Raines is being held locally, pending transfer. We've executed search warrants on the sheriff's office and Vance's private property." He paused. "I can tell you that what we found is consistent with what Addison documented and then some." "Ray Parker," James said, "working on it." Darrow's voice was careful in the way of a man communicating that he knew the question mattered and was taking it seriously. "We found records at the property that suggest Parker was moved rather than—" He paused again. "Rather than the alternative. We're pursuing a specific lead in Tennessee. I can't say more than that yet." James absorbed this. "The dog," Darrow continued. "Duke. Technically he belongs to the county, under the circumstances of his custody claim. But given that the custody claim was filed by an officer, now under federal indictment, the paperwork is effectively void." He paused. "You're looking to claim him?" "I'm considering it." "Consider faster," Darrow said, not unkindly. "Because in the absence of an owner, he'll go to county animal control, which is also currently under investigation, and may not be operational by tomorrow morning." James looked in the mirror. Duke was asleep, his head on Rook's back, his breathing slow and medicated, and more peaceful than anything James had seen from him yet. Rook was awake, watching James's eyes in the mirror with that unbroken attention. "File the paperwork," James said. "I'll have it ready for your signature in the morning. There's a notary in Hazard who can process it before noon, if you can loop back through." "I can loop back through." "Good." Darrow's voice shifted slightly. "Callum, for what it's worth, this was going to be a very long federal process before you stopped at that gas station. We had file and no entry point. You provided the entry point in about 45 minutes. I stopped for gas," James said. "Sure," Darrow said. "Take care of the dog." He hung up. James drove through the rain and thought about entry points. About how the things that changed the direction of a situation were rarely the things that looked significant when they happened. A truck pulling into a lot. A man choosing to get out rather than drive away. A woman in a green coat in a diner window who had been waiting for 2 years for someone to walk through a door who looked like they could do something with what she knew. He thought about Duke, about what it meant to be a message, to be used as proof that standing up changes nothing. He thought about the specific arrogance required to believe that, about how wrong it was. He looped back through Harlan the next morning as planned. The town looked different in clear weather. Or maybe it looked the same, and what had changed was what you knew about it. The way a room looks different when you understand the architecture, when you can see which walls are load-bearing and which ones are just partition. The sheriff's office had a federal notice on the door, and a car parked outside that was not county. The gas station lot was empty of cruisers. Bobby Marsh was open, his door propped, music coming out from inside that James could hear from across the street. He stopped in. Bobby looked up from behind the register. Something in his face shifted when he recognized James. Something that had been braced quietly, the way people brace when they've been living under a thing for years and can't yet believe the weight is gone. "Coffee," Bobby said. "Please." Bobby poured without being asked, exactly how he took it, which James noted as the observation of a man who paid attention to the world. "How's the dog?" "Sleeping, mostly." James accepted the cup. "He's going to be okay." Bobby nodded. Then he was quiet for a moment, both hands on the counter, looking at the space between them. "I should have done something," he said finally. "Years ago, I knew what was happening, and He stopped. "I told myself I couldn't, that it wasn't safe." He looked up. "But it wasn't me who was chained to that post for 19 days. James held the coffee cup. "No," he said, "it wasn't." Bobby's jaw worked. "That's not a reproach you're offering me?" "No." James looked at him steadily. "Fear is real. What Vance built in this county was designed specifically to make people afraid, to make the cost of speaking up feel higher than anyone could pay. Understanding how that works isn't excusing it. It's just understanding it." Bobby was quiet. Then, "What happens now? To the town, to all of it? New sheriff, new department, federal oversight during the transition." James set the cup down. "It'll be uncomfortable for a while. Change usually is. But the machinery that was keeping everything in place is gone." Bobby nodded slowly. He reached under the counter and pulled out something James hadn't expected. A photograph in a plain frame. A German shepherd, younger and heavier than Duke, sitting in front of this exact gas station. A boy of about 9 years old beside him, both of them looking at the camera with the uncomplicated ease of a summer afternoon. "That's Duke and Ray Parker's boy," Bobby said. "Before everything." He set it on the counter. "Thought you might want to have it. For Duke. When he's better." James looked at the photograph for a long moment. He picked it up carefully. "Thank you, Bobby." Bobby made a gesture that meant, "It's the least I could do. And also, I know that. And also, I'm going to have to learn to live with what I didn't do. And I'm going to start that process right now. By doing something." James drank the rest of his coffee and went to sign the paperwork. The notary in Hazard was a woman named Mrs. Florence Kettridge, who was 82 years old, had been notarizing documents in that county since before James was born, and processed his paperwork for Duke's transfer of ownership, with the brisk efficiency of someone for whom this was simply the next task in a life organized around getting things done properly. She stamped the final page and looked over her glasses at him. "Military? Navy? Retired?" She nodded, as though this confirmed something she'd already concluded. "The dog will be good for you," she said. James looked at the paperwork in his hands. "I think it's the other way around." Mrs. Kettridge made a sound that suggested she found this distinction unnecessary. "Both, then," she said. He reached his brother's house in Knoxville at 4 in the afternoon. Tommy Callum was 2 years older than James. A high school history teacher, with a yard that backed onto a creek, and a disposition so fundamentally different from his brother's that people who met them together sometimes asked if they were sure they were related. Where James was contained and economical, Tommy was expressive, warm, the kind of man who laughed easily and meant it every time. He came out onto the porch when James pulled into the driveway, and he looked at the truck, and then at James, and then at the back seat, where 2 dogs were visible through the rear window. "You said 2 dog beds," Tommy said. "Yes." "That's a German shepherd." "Yes." "You've had him since yesterday." James got out of the truck. "I've had him since yesterday." Tommy came down the porch steps. He looked through the window at Duke, who was awake now, watching Tommy, with the careful assessment of an animal, still recalibrating the meaning of unfamiliar faces. Tommy didn't tap the glass or make sounds at him. He just looked, then stepped back. "Ribs?" he said to James. "3 fractured. Left shoulder?" "Blunt force," repeated. Tommy nodded slowly. He looked at his brother. How bad was the person who did it? James thought about Colt Rains and the hickory dowel and the specific satisfaction in his face when he circled something that couldn't fight back. He thought about 19 mornings of that. 19 days of using a living creature as a demonstration of what power looked like when it had no one to answer to. Bad, he said. Is he in custody? Federal, as of yesterday. Tommy absorbed this. Then he put his hands in his pockets and looked at the two dogs in the back seat and the rain-cleaned hills behind the driveway and said, "All right, bring them in. I'll put water bowls down." James opened the truck. Rook came out first. Did his standard assessment of the property in approximately 90 seconds. Perimeter, exits, potential threat vectors. Tommy's disposition concluded favorable and stood at ease. Duke came out slowly, favoring his left side, his nose working the new smells of a new place, with the focused thoroughness of an animal, trying to understand a world that kept changing faster than he could map it. He stood in the driveway for a moment, with the October sun on his back, and his copper eyes moving across everything. Then he looked at James. James put his hand on Duke's head, gentle and still. "This is okay," he said. "You're safe here." Duke leaned into his hand. Just slightly, just enough. Rook watched this from 4 feet away, with the particular expression of a dog who would not admit to being moved by anything but clearly was. Tommy watched from the porch steps. He went inside to put the water bowls down and didn't say anything, because Tommy Callum knew, as the brother of James Callum, that some things were better understood than spoken, and what he had just watched in his driveway was one of them. 3 days into Knoxville, James's phone rang at 6 in the morning. Agent Darrow. James was already up, which Darrow apparently expected, because he didn't apologize for the hour. "Ray Parker," Darrow said. "We found him." James went still. "He's alive," Darrow continued. "He's in a Veterans Affairs facility in Cookeville, Tennessee, 40 miles from where you're sitting, give or take. He was admitted 6 months ago under a different name. Not his choice. Vance had connections at a county level that allowed a paperwork manipulation that we're still untangling. He was told his family had been informed of his location and chose not to make contact. He's been sitting in that facility for 6 months, believing his wife gave up on him." James sat down on the edge of the bed. "His wife," James said, "doesn't know he's alive. She was told by Vance's people, through channels she had no reason to distrust, that he had been found deceased in a single-vehicle accident and that the body had been cremated per county procedure before she could be notified." Darrow paused. It was sophisticated. This wasn't improvised. Vance had done this before. James absorbed this. "What does Parker's condition look like?" "Physically, he's recovered from whatever happened to him before the facility. Mentally," Darrow paused carefully. 6 months of believing your family has moved on is not a small thing to process. He's going to need support. Does he know yet? That his wife doesn't know?" "We told him this morning." He paused. He asked about the dog. James looked at the closed bedroom door, beyond which Rook and Duke were in the living room. Duke on the bed Tommy had bought yesterday, specifically because his brother's face, when he looked at that dog, was not the face of someone whose dog situation was temporary. "Tell him the dog is okay," James said. "Tell him the dog did his job." Darrow was quiet for a moment. "You want to be there when we reunite the family?" James thought about it. He thought about what Claire had said in the diner, that Vance kept Duke at that post as proof that standing up changes nothing. He thought about what it would mean, concretely and completely, to close that argument. "Yes," he said, "I'll be there." The drive to Cookeville took 43 minutes. James drove alone, which was unusual. Usually at least Rook was in the passenger seat. But today he'd left both dogs with Tommy, who had accepted this assignment with the adaptability of a man who had spent the last 3 days becoming unexpectedly attached to 2 German shepherds and was not entirely displeased about it. The VA facility was a low brick building set back from the road, well maintained. The grounds the kind of careful that, said people here understood that environment mattered to recovery. Agent Darrow met James in the parking lot with a woman James recognized immediately from how she stood. The posture of someone who had been holding themselves together by force of will. For so long it had become structural. Laura Parker was 36 years old, dark-haired, wearing a jacket that was slightly too light for the October temperature, in the way of someone who had left the house faster than she'd planned. She was holding her daughter's hand, a girl of about 11, who had her father's eyes. James could see that immediately. That same quality of focused attention, and she was looking at the facility entrance with the expression of a person who has been told something so large they can only approach it incrementally. She looked at James when Diro introduced him. "You have Duke," she said. "He's safe," James said. "He's recovering. He's going to be okay." Laura Parker pressed her lips together. "He told me once that if anything ever happened, Duke would know what to do." She exhaled carefully. I thought it was just something people say." "He meant it," James said. "Duke held out for 19 days. He led us to where everything started, and he didn't give anything up." Laura looked at her daughter. The girl was watching James with those focused eyes. Not frightened, just taking everything in with the thorough attention of a child who has learned that information matters. "Can we go in?" Laura said to Diro. "Yes," Diro said. "He's ready." They walked in together. James slightly behind, Diro to the side. The hallway was clean and quiet, morning light coming through windows at the far end. A nurse met them and walked them down a corridor and stopped at a door and knocked twice and opened it. Ray Parker was sitting in a chair by the window. He was thin in the way of a man who had lost weight under circumstances and not yet recovered it all, but he was upright and his eyes were clear, and when the door opened and he saw his wife in the doorway, those eyes did something that James had to look away from, because it was not something that belonged to anyone but them. The daughter ran. Ray Parker caught her out of the chair and held on, and Laura Parker crossed the room, and there was a moment that James experienced as a man who was standing in the right place at the right time, which was outside it, which was where he belonged. Diro stood beside him in the hallway. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Diro said quietly, 6 months. He spent 6 months in there thinking they'd moved on. And she spent 6 months thinking he was gone, James said. Diro nodded. That's what Vance built. Not just corruption, not just money. He built a machine for destroying people and making the destruction look inevitable. James looked through the small window in the door at the family inside. Machines break, he said. Yes, Diro agreed. They do, when someone decides they're worth breaking. On the drive back to Knoxville, James's phone buzzed. A text from a number he recognized now, Claire Addison. I've been contacted by the State Police Internal Affairs Unit. They want my documentation for a wider investigation into pattern corruption in 6 counties. She paused in the text. Then, I didn't know it was that big. James typed back. It usually is. Are you okay? Her reply took a minute. Getting there. What about you? He thought about that. He thought about a gas station lot, and a chain on a concrete post, and a dog who had held his gaze through 19 days, without dropping his eyes. He thought about a photograph of a boy and his dog on a summer afternoon. He thought about Parker in that chair, and his daughter running, and the specific, irreversible nature of a thing that has been repaired. He typed, getting there. He drove back through the October hills toward his brother's house, and the 2 dogs waiting in it. And the rain that had been following him since yesterday finally moved east, and the sky opened up into the particular clear blue of a day that has decided to be itself completely. And James Callum drove under it with both hands on the wheel, and something in his chest that was not yet peace, but was moving in that direction, the way rivers move, not fast, not dramatic, but with the complete and unhurried certainty of something that knows exactly where it's going. Ray Parker came home on a Friday. It was not a dramatic homecoming in the way that homecomings get filmed and shared, and turned into the kind of content that people forward to each other, with the caption, "You need to see this." It was quiet, the way the real versions of things tend to be quiet. Because real things don't perform themselves for an audience. They just happen, solidly and completely, in the specific texture of ordinary life. James drove Parker from the facility to the house his wife had been renting in Tennessee, the one she'd moved into after Vance's people told her she was a widow. It was a small house on a corner lot, with a dogwood tree in the front yard that had dropped its leaves for the season, but still held its shape, the clean architecture of a thing that would come back in spring. Laura had strung lights along the porch railing sometime in the last week, the small, warm kind, and they were on in the late afternoon gray when James pulled into the driveway. Parker didn't get out of the truck immediately. He sat looking at the house and the lights and the dogwood tree, with the expression of a man relearning the coordinates of his own life, matching what he remembered against what existed, finding them close enough to trust. James didn't say anything. He'd learned a long time ago that some silences were not empty but full, and interrupting them was a form of damage. After a moment, Parker said, "I thought about Duke every day in there." James looked at him. "I kept thinking," he paused, jaw working. "I kept thinking that if Duke was still out there, if he was still holding on, then I had to hold on too. Like we had a deal." He exhaled. "Is that a strange thing to say?" "No," James said. "It's not strange at all." Parker nodded slowly. Then he opened the door. The daughter, Emma, came off the porch at a run for the second time in 3 days, and Ray Parker caught her again. And Laura came out behind her and put her arms around both of them. And James sat in the truck and watched it through the windshield and felt the specific, clean satisfaction of a thing completed that had been badly broken. He started the engine after a few minutes. Parker looked back over his shoulder. "You're not coming in?" James shook his head. "This part's yours." Parker held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Tell Duke." He stopped. "Just tell him I said he's a good dog." "I'll tell him," James said. He drove back to Knoxville through the early dark. The hills, on either side of the highway, folding into shadow. The sky ahead, holding the last thin line of orange above the tree line before it let go, completely into night. Duke was on the couch when James got back. This was technically not permitted under the rules James had established on day one, but Rook was also on the couch, which suggested the rules had been subject to democratic revision in his absence. Tommy was in the kitchen making something that smelled like actual food, the kind that required more than one pan, and he called out when he heard the door without turning around, because after 39 years, he could identify his brother's footsteps. "How'd it go?" James stood in the doorway between the hall and the living room and looked at the 2 dogs on the couch. Duke's copper eyes found him immediately, the way they always found him now, not with the vigilance of an animal tracking a threat, but with the particular attention of one that had decided a specific person was its fixed point. "It went right," James said. Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway with a wooden spoon. "Parker's home?" "Parker's home." Tommy nodded. "Good." He went back to the stove. "Dinner's in 20 minutes. Wash your hands." James crossed the living room and sat on the couch between the 2 dogs. Rook pressed against his left side with his customary certainty. Duke pressed against his right with something newer and more careful. The lean of an animal that was still learning to believe that leaning was allowed. James put his hand on Duke's neck. He said it quietly. "The way you say things that are meant only for the person they're meant for," he said to tell you. "You're a good dog." Duke's tail moved. Slow, and then more certain. The way trust moves when it's finding its footing. 2 weeks later, James signed the lease on a property outside of Harlan County. It was not a decision he had planned when he stopped at that gas station 6 weeks ago. But the lease existed now, the way things exist when a sequence of true events leads somewhere that turns out to be right. Not as a surprise exactly, but as a recognition, like a direction you'd been moving toward without knowing you were moving. The property was 12 acres, a main house, a barn that needed work, and enough land to run dogs properly. Claire Addison had found it and sent him the listing without comment, which was her way of commenting. Agent DeRoe had called when he heard and said the federal oversight period for Harlan County was going to require someone with James's particular background to be regionally present, which was not how Darrow phrased it but was what he meant. Nora Hess had said she expected to see both dogs for follow-up appointments regularly, which meant she expected him to stay. Tommy had driven down to look at the property with him and stood in the middle of the empty barn and said, "You're going to fill this with dogs, aren't you?" "Probably," James said. Tommy looked at the rafters. "You know what you're doing?" James thought about that honestly. With the property and the legal situation and the oversight work, yes. With everything else. He looked at Duke standing in the barn doorway with the October light behind him and Rook at his side. 2 dogs who had survived damage and come through to the other side of it. He was learning. "That's enough," Tommy said. "It's enough," James agreed. The day James moved in, Bobby Marsh drove out from town with a casserole his wife had made and a copy of the local paper that had run the full story. Vance's indictment. Raines in federal custody. the investigation widening into 4 additional counties, and a photograph that James recognized from the angle. Dashcam footage, slightly grainy, a German shepherd chained to a post, and a man in a truck choosing to stop. The headline read, "He stopped for gas." What he found changed everything. Bobby set the paper on the kitchen counter without making a speech about it. James appreciated that. Claire Addison came by that evening. She was working as a consultant for the State Police Internal Affairs Unit now, a role that had been offered quickly once the scope of what her documentation contained became clear. She stood on the porch and looked at the property and said, "You're staying." "I'm staying." "Good." She looked at Duke, who had come out to investigate the visitor, and was currently allowing her to scratch behind his ears with the magnanimous permission of an animal that had expanded its circle of trusted people carefully and on his own terms. "He's different than he was. He's healing," James said. "It takes time." Claire nodded. She understood this from the inside. She looked at the hills, at the last light on them, at the barn and the main house and the 12 acres that were going to become something. "What are you going to call it?" James had been thinking about this since he signed the lease. He'd thought about names that meant strength, or justice, or recovery. He'd thought about naming it after a mission, or a unit, or a date that mattered. All of those felt like they were reaching for something external, something that needed to announce itself. He looked at Duke. He thought about a dog who had held his gaze through 19 days without looking away, who had leaned into a stranger's hand on a concrete lot in the cold and decided, on the basis of that single moment, to trust again, who had carried a man's secret through weeks of deliberate cruelty and delivered it intact to the people who could use it. "Copper eyes," he said. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. The real kind. The kind she didn't produce easily. "That's right," she said. Duke looked up at James from the porch, with those copper eyes, steady and warm and present. The eyes of an animal that had been used as a message and had become, instead, something entirely different. Proof. Not proof that cruelty wins. Not proof that power is permanent. But proof of the thing that Vance and Rains and every person who had ever chained something helpless to a post and called it discipline had fundamentally misunderstood. That loyalty outlasts what's done to it. That some things don't break, no matter how long the chain. That a dog can hold his gaze through 19 days of everything and still choose, when the right person crouches down and extends the back of his hand, to press his nose forward into the possibility of something better. Rook came out of the house and sat beside James on the porch, his black masked face turned toward the hills, his breathing even and unhurried. Duke pressed against James's leg. The last light moved off the hills, and the property went quiet in the good way, the way of a place that had found its purpose. James stood on his porch and looked at what was in front of him. A long road in, a longer one ahead. Dogs that needed someone to stay, and someone who had learned, finally, that staying was not the opposite of moving, that you could plant yourself in the right place and do more from there than you ever did from the road. He was home. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to remember that one person choosing not to look away can change everything. Drop your dog's name in the comments below. We read every single one, and we want to hear about the animals who made your world better. If you're new here, subscribe, because every story on this channel is built around one truth. Ordinary people doing the right thing in the right moment is never ordinary. We'll see you in the next one.